So let us start with the blessing for studying the Torah this morning. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu
melech haolam
asher
kiddushanu b'mitzvotav
v'tzivanu
la'asok
divrei
Torah.
We are in Parashat Mishpatim, Exodus 21, and we're going to start there, but we're going to skip around a bit. Let's just set the scene. So Moses has been up to the top of the mountain and has received the commandment, which was just last week. And we now come to this next section called Mishpatim. Mishpat is the word for law in Hebrew, and it's still today. So if you're a lawyer, or you go to a court of law, it's Beit Mishpat, a house of law, or court of law. Mishpatim are laws they're used in modern Hebrew as well. But in the biblical usage, Mishpatim has a particular resonance, meaning laws to be enacted, and they usually have some kind of justification for them. There are other laws or guidelines that are in the Bible that sometimes don't have any justification, and they're all mixed together, so it's difficult to know which are which. But the other thing that's slightly strange about what we're going to read is that all of the laws are mixed up. So you don't have like laws dealing with the civil courts, and then laws dealing with say criminal cases, and laws dealing with domestic issues, and laws dealing with cultic issues. They're all mixed up together. So we're not entirely sure kind of who put this all together and why it's a bit of a mix up. And there is a lot of speculation that a lot of these laws came from societies outside of the Israelite community, particularly the laws of Hammurabi. And if you've been to the British Museum and seen the tablets that they brought in from Assyria, they're listed, all the laws, and Hammurabi is considered to be the first ancient king who had a set of laws that the people had to abide by. And it's considered that the Bible has really replicated those laws here in Parashat Mishpatim, but changed them a little bit, and we'll see some of the changes. And some of them are just fall away and are never considered again because they're not relevant anymore. Some of them are brought up to date in order to make them relevant. We'll see some examples of that. And in the end, when you count them all up, it's considered to be 613. And the number 613 then becomes the number that people use to say how many laws are there for Judaism. The issue with the number, however, it's so arbitrary because some laws, as I say, actually you can't even fulfill them anymore because they're related to something to do with the temple or the Mishkan in the desert, or some laws are only to be given and done in the land of Israel. And then there are some laws that sometimes are combined into one, that they could be separated out as two. So the number really is completely spurious. And in the end, the reason why it's 613 is because the ancients believed that there were 346 bones in the body and 248 sinews. And that made up 613, which was a body. So it's a body of law, if you like. So Any questions about Jewish law before we go into this?
Just a quick question. How long before this was Hammurabi's code? So was this around for a long time, or was it contemporary?
We think contemporary. So the book of Exodus, the events of the book of Exodus, that means the Exodus from Egypt, we consider around 1200 BCE. So that would be contemporaneous with other ancient societies. So it's likely they could have, known about it and copied it. However, as we all know, it wasn't actually written down until much later, which of course might be another reason why they're all a bit of a hodgepodge, because they were remembered differently by different groups of people. And some of them actually are remembered because there's a flow of language, like there's a repetition of words. We'll find the words mot yamut time and time again. Mot yamut comes up time and time again. It means you shall put to death. So those two words are repeated quite a lot of times, and we'll see that.
Now, one other technical question. You said, I thought I heard you say these aren't laws themselves, these are instructions to create laws. Is that right? Or they're little of each?
Yeah. You have to derive the specific action from these laws, and that's why we have an ongoing literary and judicial tradition that goes beyond the Bible into law books like the Talmud or the Mishnah Torah, which is a book that Maimonides wrote to try and codify these laws and then make them into specific enactments. The famous one, which we're going to look at, is you shall not boil a kid in its mother's milk. And that goes from that statement, which has no other and justification to it, all the way up to, you shall have 2 dishwashers and
4 sets of dishes and
and toothbrushes that are blue and red. It goes wild afterwards, but it starts off with one sentence. Okay, let's go to this. Okay, who would like to start us off reading? We're going to start with slavery, just to make it clear. David, how about you?
Sure. These are the rules that you shall set before them. When you acquire a Hebrew slave, that person shall serve 6 years and shall go free in the 7th year without payment. If a male slave came single, he shall leave single. If he had a wife, his wife shall leave with him. If his master gave him a wife, and she has borne him children, the wife and her children shall belong to the master, and he shall leave alone. But if the slave declares, I love my master and my wife and children, I do not wish to go free, his master shall take him before God. He shall be brought to the door or the doorpost, and his master shall pierce his ear with an awl, and he shall then remain his master's slave for life.
Okay, let's pause there. What do you notice about this?
slavery isn't forever.
And it's just talking about Hebrew slaves.
Yeah, very good. So first of all, these are slaves within the community. The word slave, I'm afraid, is really not a good translation. The only word we have in the Bible for this condition is eved. Eved can mean so many different things. You can be an Eved Adonai, like a slave of God or a servant of God. But Eved here really means someone who is bound by a legal enactment to serve another person. And as you can see, this is not chattel slavery like in the American South. This is indentured slavery, servitude, indentured servitude, where someone, and it could be for many reasons, we're going to see some reasons in a minute, but particularly for debt. So if a family gets into debt, they might have to sell their children to another family who would then serve the family for a period of time. And here we have 6 years or 7 years to go free in the 7th year. The 7th year, of course, is the sabbatical year. And we know from other readings that the 7th year in Israelite society was considered not only freedom for people in indentured servitude, but also for the land as well. So the land was fallow in the 7th year. And that's where the word sabbatical comes from. And then every 7 times 7 years, there would be what's called a jubilee. And then there would be also a releasing of all servants.
When did that all start? I mean, this whole system.
Yeah, the biblical tradition, probably, well, we're talking about Israelites being in the land of Israel from about 1000 BCE. So we're talking about a society. Remember, these laws are being given in the wilderness at the bottom of Mount Sinai. So they're about 10 months after the Exodus from Egypt, according to the timeline. So we're still in the wilderness, but we're eventually going to get into the promised land. And then these laws will be applicable in the promised land around 1000, from about 1000 BCE, all the way up to the end of the biblical period, which, we could date around maybe 500 when they go into exile in Babylon. So for about 500 years.
And I'm just being sort of semantic, that it's not entirely clear, does the slave serve for 6 years and goes free in the 7th year all without payment, or is it just in the 7th year that he goes without payment?
Let's have a look at the Hebrew. Ki tukane eved ivri sheish shanim ya'avod uvashivat yitzei l'chafshi chinam. Well, I'm not sure it says without payment. It says chinam, the last word of that line, which really means gracefully. It's from the word grace. So it really means without any penalty, I think. Yeah.
It's more sort of just consensual.
Lucy has her hand up.
Just looking at a different translation. No, it's without payment in this one too. Yeah. Peter or Rob, yeah.
Oh, I was going to say I think I read this differently than you, Jill. I thought it meant that, so the slave is paying a debt, so he's not getting paid, he's repaying. Maybe he was sold into slavery by his parents, right?
Yeah.
So he's not getting paid during the 6 years, but what I thought this meant was in the 7th year he goes free without having to pay to his master any further.
Right. I think that's right.
Okay.
Yeah.
That makes sense.
I guess I was being a little too Amelia Bedelia. A little too literal.
I have a couple of questions.
1 second, Lucy. Just going to read the commentary in the Plaut Chumash. It says, emancipation is his by right, and no compensation is due to the master. The law in Deuteronomy requires that the master make general provisions for the slave who leaves his service. Yeah. Okay, Lucy.
Well, it says when you acquire a Hebrew slave, are there other types of slaves to acquire at that time?
Yeah, we are going to get different categories. Yeah.
Okay. And when they go free on the 8th year or the 1st year of the next 7 years, do they have to come back?
No, they've paid their debt. You're not allowed to have a debt that's bigger than someone who would have to serve for 7 years. So it doesn't matter how big your debt is. No one should serve more than that time. The question you could ask is, was this actually a system? Is it just words on a page, or did they actually operate the system? And of course, we have no knowledge whether the system actually operated this way or not.
It sounds like a system. I mean, this is not the kind of thing that you sit around, as a philosopher and, spin out. So this sounds like, there's when they're writing this thing, they're not writing it, this isn't, if I can be so sacrilegious as to suggest this is not all being drafted either by God or at the bottom of Mount Sinai. They're in a actual agricultural world, and they're writing this retrospectively. And it sounds like, this is our system. This is the way we do things here.
Yeah. The only reason why I'm asking the question is because the equivalent of the 6 years of working the land and then leaving 1 year fallow, eventually becomes untenable. So that system doesn't last. And in fact, you get lots of commentary about the fact that there has to be a better system than that. So whether this system with regard to servitude worked or not, I mean, it's feasible. I think we all know there are societies that have this system, or continuing, where your apprentice, your family maybe are poor, you apprentice your child to a master, the master teaches the apprentice a trade, eventually he's allowed after a certain amount of time to go off and have his own business. So it's not unknown to us.
Yeah, the early years of the
Can I-
American
can I
Republic were, had indentured servitude.
Yeah.
Can I
Peter,
just ask something? It sounds as if we're only talking about male indentured slaves. It's not, is it the reading that female slaves are slaves without hope?
without what?
Hope.
Oh,
They are slaves in our traditional, there's nothing about freeing them, at least so far.
Right, that the wife and the children shall remain with the master.
Or what about a single woman who's sold? Am I reading that wrong? I mean,
we'll get there. We'll get there. So you're
okay.
running ahead.
Yeah.
Peter,
If I may, I don't quite see, it isn't totally clear to me how this is related to the sabbatical year. Does the servant, the Abed, serve for 6 years from the time he was acquired and go out in that 7th year, or does everyone go free during the sabbatical year? Because it does say proclaim liberty throughout the land and all that.
That's a really good question. That when did the cycle? Does everybody follow the same cycle?
Right.
And that's like why I'm asking the question. I don't know if the system actually operated or not, but there were later on, when this is all prescribed, the Hillel and Shammai discuss this, and they suggest that people are going to be very reluctant to take a servant in the 6th year,
Right.
the 7-year cycle, because then they'll only serve 1 year. Well, that's you're being done out of your payment. So the same goes for a loan, or indeed for buying a field. So there's a lot of problems with this that come up later on, which is why that system is changed. Particularly the agricultural system is changed.
And the Jubilee year, hypothetically, it might be a good idea, but that the land goes back to whomever the original owner was just seems completely impractical.
Yeah. And some church, I can't remember which church it is, has calculated when the Jubilee should occur every year, every 50 years, because they've counted it back to the biblical period. And of course, that's a little bit did anybody else want to say anything before we move on? Sorry.
Just how did all these slaves get to be slaves in the first place? Was battle just because their parents were from someplace back in history? How did they get into that state?
Debt, family debt. The
Who's-
harvest
Debt,
debt. Yeah,
money, it goes back to money.
money.
Oh, yeah.
Well,
Money makes the world go round.
Right, let's go on. Okay, if he doesn't want to go free, did we read this?
Yeah.
Yeah. So this unusual ritual at the doorpost of the house, and we know what we do with the doorpost of the house. And here the master puts a hole in his ear, and so he's marked for life as a slave because he wants to remain a slave. So very unusual ritual, and it's only if he wishes to do that. Let's go on to the girl.
Oh, here's Gail's answer, right?
Yeah.
Right there.
Peter, do you want to read this?
When a parent sells a daughter as a slave, she shall not go free as other slaves do. If she proves to be displeasing to her master, who designated her for himself, he must let her be redeemed. He shall not have the right to sell her to outsiders, since he broke faith with her. And if the master designated her for a son, he shall deal with her as is the practice with free maidens. If he takes another into the household as his wife, he must not withhold from this one her food, her clothing, or her conjugal rights. If he fails her in these three ways, she shall go free without payment.
Okay.
It
So-
sounds like the only reason one would acquire a female slave was to be as a concubine rather than to do any other work.
Right.
Anyway,
Yeah,
that's
this is big time patriarchal society.
Do you think?
Yeah, there's very different situation, treating women very differently, and of course through history we have seen that.
What is the Hebrew word for a female slave? Is it different? It just disappeared off the top there. I was trying to find it.
Oh, sorry.
Is it different? Is it still Eved, or is it
Well, they use the word Amah here. In this line here, it says V'ki yimkor ish. If a man sells 8 bito, his daughter, la Amah, lo tetse ketset avadim. So she's treated it. The word Amah is used there as a female slave.
and also it's about being sold by a parent. Like, it's not a situation where women, it doesn't seem to be one where women are in the business world themselves and handling their own money and going into debt. Am I right?
Right. And this is also not, this is a case, as you said, where a parent sells a daughter, and that would be for a debt. This is not like a war bride or someone who's kidnapped because of a war. What I would only say about this, and Jane's right, it's very patriarchal. The only amelioration of the Hammurabi law is that the Hammurabi laws were much worse for women. So the Hebrew peoples seem to have tried to lighten the servitude for women by providing opportunities for where they could go free, and that the man had a responsibility to this woman with clothing and food and conjugal rights. And if he didn't keep up with those rights or brought another wife into the household, then she had the right to petition for her freedom. So there is an amelioration of the whole system that was much harsher in the ancient Near East. And,
No, can I just question? Yeah, I mean, I do read that here, that, you know, there's an actual concern here for protecting her rights, obviously not, you know, from an assumption, you know, that we would have in the United States but nonetheless, you can see that there's a concern here. You said if he brings another wife in, that does it. I don't. But he could have several wives anyhow, who are without anything to do with slaves, right?
Yeah, but he can't have a new wife and then discard the old wife and
He
not.
can't discard her.
Right.
Correct.
Right. He's still got to take care of it. If he adds a new wife, and as we know in the Bible, they had a number of wives, then yeah, he had to treat each wife separately and correctly.
Right.
Back to the word ama, I was looking at another translation and it gets translated as handmade.
Yeah.
Can you say anything more about that word and how it's used here and elsewhere? Do we know anything about its meaning or its use or how it's specific to women?
I'm looking in the Chumash, see if there's any commentary on that.
Hmm.
Look in the other Chumash. No, doesn't even mention it.
Yeah. By the way, I'm looking here what you have on the screen. He shall not have a right to sell it to outsiders since he broke faith with her. Just try contrasting this with American slavery.
Yeah.
The idea that you could break faith with somebody, with your slave. No, that concept didn't compute in American slavery.
Right.
Right.
So I did
The
find
branding did.
I found a comment, Jane. This is from the Eighth Time Chumash. It says
Mhm.
the Hebrew word amah used here for slave indicates a status quite different from that of the male slave. In the ancient world, a father driven by poverty might sell his daughter to a wealthy family to ensure her future security. The sale
That's what you said.
The sale pre-proposes marriage to the master or his son, with the Torah stipulating that the girl must be treated as a wife. Yeah, what we said.
Thank you.
Okay, so let's go on a little bit more. A bit more about slavery.
But of course, very, very importantly, this is all within the Hebrew people. So this is not, so there's a concern to protect.
Right. Yeah, it's your own people. Yeah.
Yep.
Maybe Rob, would you like to read a bit?
Sure. One who fatally strikes another party shall be put to death. If a man did so, but not by design, it came about by an act of God, I will assign you a place to which he can flee. When one party schemes against another and kills through treachery, you shall take that person from my very altar to be put to death. One who strikes one's father or mother shall be put to death. One who kidnaps another party, whether having sold or still holding the victim, shall be put to death. One who insults one's father or mother shall be put to death. I'm in trouble here. Okay.
Oh, there really?
Let's see. When two parties quarrel and one strikes the other with stone or fist and the victim does not die but has to take to bed, if that victim then gets up and walks outdoors upon a staff, the assailant shall go unpunished except for paying for the idleness and the cure.
So, first of all, that the phrase that I told you about earlier here, mot yamut, shall be put to death, is repeated a number of times, and this might suggest why these items are all together in a section here. Obviously, we've moved away from slavery now, and we've gone into another whole area. So capital punishment obviously is relevant and doesn't say anything about a process for that here. That has to be added on later by the later commentators. And in general, every time that in the Bible we're told you can put someone to death, later on the commentators say, you know what, that's not really viable because you've got to have two witnesses and they've got to have seen it and they've got to have the opportunity to stop someone doing that. So they try every which way to actually eliminate capital punishment from Jewish law. So although if you lived just the Bible, and we know there are people who live just the Bible, all kinds of peoples around the world who just take the Bible as their law code. But if you're Jewish, capital punishment has been pretty much eliminated certainly from Jewish law. There is no case where in Jewish law you can kill someone. Legally, from a judicial point of view, the only case famously that came up in the 1960s was the case of Adolf Eichmann. And in the end, the judges in Israel decided they would use British law to judge him, British common law, because of the mandate, rather than Jewish law. So that enabled them to rule a capital punishment against him. But the state of Israel does not have capital punishment generally as a form of punishment, and no Jewish community ever enacted the capital punishment that's stated in the Bible.
Oh, so there weren't a lot of people being killed for insulting their parents?
That seems a little rash.
No one would make it past teenager if they were like.
I was thinking wouldn't even make it
So
to
this is
10.
Shane.
Yeah. This is really important for Jewish-Christian relations, because often the misunderstanding by Christians will be just based on the Bible without the commentary.
Right.
So one of the more important things that Christians need to learn in the dialogue is that the Bible doesn't stand alone in Judaism, so you can't compare text to text. Just a little, interreligious relations comment, but that's a really important thing, and not all Christians have that awareness that in Judaism you never have the text alone, you have the whole bunch of traditions. And in fact that's the case in Christianity too, but many Christians acknowledge that even less. So
Catholics and Orthodox.
But in Judaism it's
absolutely right, Jane.
Yeah.
And very well stated. So I have a little chart to tell us about that.
Oh, great.
Hold on. One I prepared earlier.
So Peter, were you implying that the Orthodox, for them, capital punishment is still relevant because it was in the...
It's not that. The point I was trying to insert is that Catholic and Orthodox traditions are very much into tradition. You have to study the Bible in relation to the way it's been interpreted over the years by their hierarchy.
Right.
It's the Protestants that are strict biblical literalists,
Right.
or the more liberal Protestants have basically given up the Bible entirely because they know it just doesn't make sense that way. The conservative Protestants are the ones that'll say the Bible says this, and we're stuck with it.
Right. There we go.
So there you see the law of Moses, that's the Bible. That's divided into two areas, what's called written Torah, which is what we're reading, and then oral Torah. Oral Torah becomes oral commentaries that are discussed and debated about the written Torah. That oral Torah is only written down much, much later. And we get what's called the Talmud. Well, first of all, we get the Mishnah. It's divided into 6 areas of life. Those 6 areas are there listed. They deal with everything that we're dealing with at the moment. So legal issues, cultic issues, criminal issues, holiness issues, issues about women, which are in a separate category, reflecting the patriarchal society. So all of those are the 6, what are called the 6 orders of the Mishnah. And then the Mishnah itself, which is considered a law book, is then commented upon by what's called the Gemara, and the Gemara and the Mishnah together become the Talmud, and the Talmud then remains for thousands of years as a way of understanding and re-looking at the written Torah in a new way and interpreting it differently, so that, as I said, in the case of capital punishment, it's pretty much written out of the law. So here we have some of the terminology. So the Mishnah itself, the word means repetition, and it's a collection of the rabbinic laws that define Jewish practice after the Second Temple was destroyed. And it's compiled in 200 of the Common Era, and it's structured by 6 topics, as we just said. Midrash is something different. Midrash is a genre of rabbinic literature that gleams meaning and practice from Bible stories and fills in gaps in those stories. So Midrash is not considered to be part of the legal halachic literature. It's a different kind of literature. And then we get to the word halacha. Halacha meaning the way. This collective term refers to all of Jewish tradition, law, and practice. And you can call something halachic because it follows the law. We're not going to get into all these different things, but Talmud is a work of rabbinic literature, including the Mishnah and the Gemara. The Gemara, as we've said later, rabbinic exploration, discussion on the Mishnah, and it goes on and on and on. So that's how, as James suggests, is how our tradition is what's called an interpretive tradition. We are not a fundamentalist religion. We do not regard the Bible, the Torah, as our fundamental source book for Jewish law. And in fact, when people count up of the 613, almost none of them remain in their original form except for the Sabbath. The Sabbath is the only kind of original one that remains pretty much as is outlined in the Torah. In other words, observing the Sabbath day as the seventh day of the week, that it should be holy and it should be a day of rest. That remains similar. Pretty much everything else gets changed one way or another. And it's interesting, if you go to a traditional house of study, a yeshiva, and Masha's nephews are both studying in a yeshiva at the moment. They don't study the Bible at all. They don't even have the Bible in the library. It's not an important book for them. They study the Mishnah and the Gemara and the Talmud.
Is there a way that we can get a copy of your last screen? It would be so helpful just to have it,
Right.
I don't have to keep asking the same question again and again.
I will work out a way of doing that for you. Yeah.
Great.
That was an important comment. Did anybody else want to talk about that? And we go back, and we'll go forward a bit. Yeah. Gail.
The 10 Commandments, I mean, most of those are still in play, and the Sabbath is there too. So if you take that as 10 Commandment, then there's nothing that's in the more recent.
Yeah, that's true. Not exactly, in that there are things there that, like, we redefine "you shall not kill" to "you shall not murder." Jewish law also redefines "you shall not steal" to "you shall not stealing people." You shall not steal people. So Jewish law does play with them and changes them a little bit. But yeah.
But
even
there are a lot of those that we still consider. Honor your father and mother.
Yeah, honor your father and mother.
Into that other thing.
Right, but if that in the Bible, honor your father and mother is an absolute clause. There's no qualification, honor your father and mother. In rabbinic law later on, it suggests that if your father abused you, you have no obligation with them. Yeah. If your parents abandon you or neglect you, then again, that law goes into abrogation. So it's just the way the rabbinic law later on really goes into case study and also case law and circumstantial law and all kinds of ways to change things.
And the Sabbath, even the Sabbath has all sorts of details that were not given literally on Mount Sinai. You can't walk this far outside of your house without. Those are all added.
Exactly.
I think.
Exactly.
Rabbi, you
yes.
mentioned you had a sentence, which is that we are not fundamentalists, and I want to know who's in the we.
Most of us here, I hope.
Yeah, what I would call anyone who inherits the rabbinic Jewish tradition. I mean, we have Jews throughout time who reject the rabbinic literature. There's a group of Jews in Russia called the Karaites, and I think there might be 2 of them left somewhere. And they, like the Amish, they want to go back to the original biblical tradition. There were Jews in India, in Cochin, who felt that way as well. Not all of them. So we have had through Jewish history Jews who've wanted to go back and be biblical Jews rather than rabbinic Jews, but 99% of the Jewish people are what I would call rabbinic Jews. We live a Judaism that follows pretty much the rabbinic, if not law, then rabbinic practice. And that it's inevitable. Nobody, even if you're the most Haredi Jew living in Mea Sharim in Jerusalem, you're still a rabbinic Jew, not a biblical Jew.
and these laws, all of this, how does this affect the Supreme Court? This might be a Richard question.
Oh, can you narrow it down a little bit? What do you have in
Our
mind?
Supreme Court or Israel's?
What do you have in mind?
Who's Supreme Court?
See, we got a question.
I don't have any one of the 9 people in mind.
No.
Okay.
I'd say, in other words, they were. I mean, the point that the rabbi is making is not that there aren't many Jews, Orthodox Jews, who are Orthodox, but what they are following is not,
Fundamental.
Well, I mean, we can see them as fundamentalists in some sense, but what they're fundamentalist about is not the Bible. It's
right. They've added something to the fundament, but they still follow it as fundamentalists.
That's
right.
very helpful. Yeah. Also, if you're thinking, Lucy, about this idea of the original, what's that called? Originalism. And this, how some members of the Supreme Court regard the Constitution as unchanging and therefore has to be followed in its literal sense. And yeah, that's a similar idea. And we don't follow that.
I would just put on that. I'd say some members of the Supreme Court pretend to regard the Constitution that way. They do it on Mondays and Thursdays.
Depends, as the Bible says, on whose ox is gored.
I think biblical, it's always seemed to me biblical interpretation and constitutional law have a lot in common.
Oh, yeah.
I always thought if I were a lawyer, I'd go into constitutional law because it's the same, there's this word document that's sacred in quotes in US society. And people talk about the Constitution in a holy document kind of way. And then we have this whole tradition of interpretation. Dick knows more about that than I do.
You're doing pretty well.
Case law. And so, it's the same kind of process. And what's the relationship to the original document? And what did the the founders, the framers, the writers, the editors, what did they mean? And so it's very similar. At least it seems to me that it is, and then there's these things build upon each other, which doesn't take away any of the anxiety any of us may have about the current case of, he who shall not be named.
Well, what hasn't come up very much in the debate over disqualification and the Insurrection Act is the fact that there is nothing in the Constitution, either the original text or the amendments, about candidacy, about running for office, about being on the ballot. These are all things that have to be read into it. Prior to the Australian ballot in the 1880s or so, there was no ballot with the names of all the candidates. The state wasn't in the business of deciding what a candidate is. If you had asked the framers about running for office, they would have found the idea quite distasteful.
So let's just go. I'll give you a taste of some of the other things as we go forward. Let's go to here, number 25. So you can see the kind of the randomness of some of these. Who hasn't read and would like to read? Jill.
You take your neighbor's garment in pledge, you must return it before the sun sets. It is the only available clothing. It is what covers the skin. In what else shall your neighbor sleep? Therefore, if that person cries out to me, I will pay heed, for I am compassionate. You shall not revile God, nor put a curse upon the chieftain among your people. You shall not put off the skimming of the first yield of your vats. You shall give me the male firstborn among your children. You shall do the same with your cattle and your flocks. 7 days the male firstborn shall remain with its mother, on the 8th day you shall give it to me. You shall be a holy people to me. You must not eat flesh torn by beasts in the field. You shall cast it to the dogs.
So you can see
What a random bunch of comments.
Yeah.
You can see a great deal of lots of individual items here. Now, what the beauty and the treasure of the rabbinic tradition was to put on heaps and heaps of laws and customs based on these single sentences. So where it says, you shall give me the first male amongst your children, we there get the tradition of what's called Pidyon Haben, which is a ceremony that takes place after the circumcision of the firstborn child. It's a ceremony that Reform Judaism doesn't particularly align with, but it's a traditional ceremony where the firstborn of the child is redeemed with money in order not to have to serve God in the temple. And we actually get the story of Samuel, who is given service in the temple, and this is connected to this idea that you shall give me your male firstborn. But then it goes on to do the same with cattle and with flocks, and this then becomes part of the sacrificial cult that comes later, in which then the first born of the cattle and the sheep and the herds are brought to Jerusalem for sacrifice, and that becomes part of the pilgrim festivals, where people from all over the land of Israel would come to Jerusalem 3 times a year to bring their products, their bikurim as it's called. And later on in Jewish tradition, that becomes part of the festival of Shavuot, when we bring the first of the flowers and the harvest of the land, the fruits and the grains, and we sometimes the synagogues will decorate for Shavuot, will decorate the pulpit with all kinds of natural produce, and it all comes from this original verse. So it's one little verse, but then it becomes a heap of mounds of Jewish practice and custom what are called minhag customs. So sometimes it's Jewish law and sometimes it's Jewish customs, and they're all derived from these verses in the Bible.
Just a quick anecdote, when they were having, my nephew was born a baby, and his father was not Jewish, so his mother was, and they had a rabbi for the pigeon. But anyway, when he did the circumcision, the father passed out, totally out cold on the floor the minute that they started to do that. And the rabbi never batted an eye. He just went on and on and on and like dared us to look at him until it was all over. And then we revived him, and it was all of that. So I can never think of that ceremony without giggling.
Usually the mother who freaks out.
Mother was Jewish and knew what to expect. The father did not.
Yeah, I was going to say, but before I get to what I want to say, I just say, I have a rule: you never sit in the front row at a circumcision. But my for a lot of reasons. But yeah, exactly. But what does it mean by you shall not? I can't remember the verbiage now. Put a curse on your chieftain. It sounds like some kind of a cult thing. Like, what is that they mean here?
Leader.
You shall not put a curse
27.
upon a chieftain. Is that like a hex? What is that?
Okay, let me look that up. That's what number? What first number is that? That's
27.
27.
27.
22, 27.
I mean, is that? It sounds like they might have meant you just shouldn't speak badly of your leaders, but that seems like an odd thing to say in Judaism. So, I wonder what they mean here.
Yeah, this is where it's really good to have a few books around you that you can refer to. Is it 23, 27?
23,
22.
22, 27.
It's 27. Yeah.
Okay, here we go. 27.
You-
Ta'or, that's from the same root as Arur Haman, isn't it?
Chieftain is the word Nasi. It just says okay, it doesn't mention anything in that one. 22, 27. Sometimes
So yeah,
they don't make a special note of everything.
Let's see.
the Fox
Yeah.
translation, the Everett Fox translation, translates the chieftain word as exalted leader, and then has a note about how God and ruler are equated, as later in the story of Naboth's vineyard in First Kings, you cursed God and the king. So does that mean there's some kind of notion that chiefs or leaders are divinely
In divine
connected
right.
or protected or instituted or anything like that?
Yep, that's what I'm getting from this commentary. It says putting a curse on a ruler is like lèse majesté in modern days.
Right.
The law implies that undermining the stability of society is comparable to blasphemy. Somebody suggests that we have a rule reflecting an old Israelite confederacy where each tribe had a chieftain or ruler. Not sure we learn a lot from that, but yeah.
So we can't criticize our leaders. Is that
No more insulting
Right.
Biden for his memory.
The only place I know where there's a strict law in force in a country that claims to be at least somewhat democratic is Thailand. You say anything against the king and you can be in big trouble.
Right. Deep sneakers.
So then as we go forward a little bit, it's not only concrete actions, but sometimes it's about intentions and about emotions. So let's read a little bit about this side of it, which is 23. Dick.
You must not carry false rumors. You shall not join hands with the guilty to act as a malicious witness. You shall neither side with the mighty to do wrong. You shall not give perverse testimony in a dispute so as to pervert it in favor of the mighty. nor shall you show deference to a poor person in a dispute. When you encounter your enemy's ox or ass wandering, you must take it back. When you see the ass of your enemy lying under its burden and would refrain from raising it, you must nonetheless help raise it. You shall not subvert the rights of your needy in their disputes. Keep far from a false charge. Do not bring death on those who are innocent and in the right, for I will not acquit you, the wrongdoer.
Okay, so we have here a series of statements with regard to our duties legally and with regard to witnessing and showing.
A lot of it could be summarized as just be a mensch.
Being an ethical human being.
Yeah, being a good neighbor.
Yeah. And
Yeah.
that is emphasized in this verse, very famous verse 9. You shall not oppress a stranger, for you know the feelings of the stranger, having yourself been strangers in the land of Egypt. So obviously that's a very famous component of the motivations, like as you said, Dick, kind of be a good person because we know what it was like to be oppressed.
But it's also about perjury, or the earlier parts.
Right.
Yeah, literally, yeah, definitely.
Yeah, no, I
You
mean,
know,
right. Yeah,
it's
I mean,
not just about being a mensch. I'm projecting modern stuff onto this, but it's about recognizing that some people have less power, and you have to pay attention to that. Again, I may be being too contemporary in my language. So it's not just to be nice to people, it's realized that, the people who are less powerful in our society, any society, deserve special attention and care. And that's very much in keeping with other parts of the Bible, like parts of the Psalms.
But I don't think this one talks about special attention and care, because after you talk about, not lying on behalf of the mighty, it says you also shouldn't do it on behalf of the poor.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Right.
and I think you both make a really good point, and I think just to add to it, I think they talk about enemies too, right? So the idea is, I think that the using of the enemies and the poor and the rich the idea is just that this law applies to everybody, right? You don't, just because you don't like
Right.
somebody or you don't identify with them, you need to apply the law equally, and
That makes sense.
yeah.
In the classic symbol of that is the justice blind with wearing a blindfold.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Right. Right.
And then on the other hand, you get the famous remark by Anatole France: the law in its majestic equality forbids rich and poor alike from begging and sleeping under bridges and things like that. There are more dimensions to this, but yeah.
Any other thoughts on this? And we're going to move to what happens with all these laws in chapter 24. Right. So let's see what God wants to do with all of these laws. We've got a sense of the ethical, the cultic, the civil and criminal components, and the ways in which they are written down, some with justification, some without, and that some of them are one-liners, which later on have to be explained and developed. And then what does it say near the end? Leslie, would you like to read for us?
Then God said to Moses, come up to
Adonai.
Oh, okay. I was thinking geographical. With Aaron, Nadab, and Abihu, and 70 elders of Israel, and bow low from afar. Moses alone shall not come near Adonai, but the others shall not come near, nor shall the people come up with him. Moses went and repeated to the people all of the commandments of Adonai and all the rules. And all the people answered with one voice, saying, all the things that Adonai has commanded, we will do. Then Moses wrote down all the commandments of Adonai. Early in the morning, he set up an altar at the foot of the mountains with 12 pillars for the tribes of Israel. He designated some assistants among the Israelites, and they offered burnt offerings and sacrificed bulls as well as offerings of well-being to Adonai.
Okay, so I just want
What do
to.
they mean by wrote down? I mean, they chiseled them
The
away.
tablets?
Well, that's a good question. I think they had alphabet. I think, is that right, Peter?
Presumably they had some way of writing. I don't know. I mean, we have the tablets that God apparently wrote with his own finger,
Yeah.
but what Moses, we don't know what writing system was available at that time. We know very little about that time, if there was at that time.
We have, obviously, we do have other writing like cuneiform and ugarit and on stone.
Mhm.
So yeah, probably chiseled on stone, I think.
But
Protein.
now they're talking about writing down all these 600 things, and that Moses did that
With a
too.
chisel on stone?
Yeah, that's what it's saying. Now let's go forward a bit more. This is a very famous line. All that Adonai has spoken, we will faithfully do. The words in Hebrew are na'aseh v'nishma. And this becomes a very important concept in Judaism, that because the word na'aseh means to do and nishma means to understand, the rabbis then suggested that the first thing in Judaism to do is to do it. And then later on, maybe by doing it, you'll understand it. So even if it's an obscure law or an obscure custom, the tradition always was, well, try it out, do it, and then you'll see if you get to some understanding of it. And that becomes a justification later on for rabbis, particularly like Chabad rabbis, to late, ask people to late fill in public, or go around with a kind of clear on their vans, or have a public Hanukkah menorah in a public square, because the idea is that Chabad believes let everybody do it, and then maybe out of that will come an understanding or a commitment or an engagement, and they're much more interested in people just doing things. Whereas Reform Judaism obviously took the opposite view, which was learning by informed decision making. That is, we don't do something unless we know the reason for which we do it, and we are very careful about bringing on new things into Judaism unless we have a real justification for feeling that's the right thing and the just thing to do. And we will dismiss things that we feel that are unjust, particularly around egalitarianism. So it was Reform Judaism that obviously brought women to the rabbinate first, and said that it was unjust only that men should be rabbis and that women should have equal status. So those are the kind of things where we would disagree with some of our compatriots about this verse, Na'aseh v'nishma, and it becomes quite a tension between different groups. And I want to just go to the end, what happens at the end. So let's go. Yeah, here, this is the very end. Yeah, verse 12. So would someone like to finish us off with verse 12? Lucy.
Verse 12. Adonai said to Moses, "Come up to me on the mountain and wait there, and I will give you the stone tablets with the teachings and commandments which I have inscribed to instruct them." So Moses and his attendant Joshua arose. Moses ascended the mountain of God. To the elders he had said, "Wait here for us until we return to you. You have Aaron and Hur with you. Let anyone who has a legal matter approach them." When Moses had descended the mountain, the cloud covered the mountain. The presence of Adonai abode on Mount Sinai, and the cloud hid it for 6 days. On the 7th day, God called to Moses from the midst of the cloud. Now the presence of Adonai appeared in the sight of the Israelites as a consuming fire on the top of the mountain. Moses went inside the cloud and ascended the mountain, and Moses remained on the mountain 40 days and 40 nights.
And that's the end of the portion. So what's interesting about this is that we often think of Moses going up to the mountain and receiving, let's say, the 10 Commandments on the tablets and bringing them down. But in this section of the Torah, actually what we're seeing is the opposite, which is Moses, God says to Moses, these are the laws that I'm going to require the people to follow. Now, I'm going to read them all out to you, and we can see how many there were. And when that's finished, only then does Moses go up to the mountain and receive them as written down laws. So rather than we shall do them and then we will, obey them, the whole portion here suggests that we need to understand them first, and then once we've agreed to them, we'll have a ritual by which we'll receive them in a mysterious fashion. And that's pretty much why modern Jews, Reform Jews, suggest that it's actually only by understanding the laws that we can really commit to them, and that where they become relevant, where they become part of a system that we both rationally accept and emotionally feel comfortable with, then that becomes part of our Jewish practice. And the form of Jewish law, of the form of Jewish halacha, becomes a way for us to think about that which is relevant and important, both for us individually, but also for us as a community. And that seems to make much more sense than just accepting everything, the 613, without consideration of what they actually mean and what they are supposed to be doing. And that allows us to make changes over time. And pretty much, I would think Judaism has tried to be as liberal as it can be, except in situations where there was particular reason to take a stricter line than a more lenient line. And that there are times in Jewish history when Jews felt like they needed to keep something stricter than perhaps they would have otherwise, because maybe Chabad in North America is particularly a particular case, in that Chabad feels that North American Jews don't really keep anything properly, and therefore that Chabad should be stricter. But when Chabad was founded in the 18th century, they were the most liberal of the Jews in their time, because everybody was Orthodox, and they felt that the law should be amended to be more liberal. But now in America, they feel that no one's Orthodox, and therefore they should try and make everybody Orthodox. So from time to time, groups of Jews have looked at Jewish law in different ways, sometimes by virtue of just trying to read and understand and interpret, and sometimes by virtue of what's happening around them, and to decide whether, what kind of practice we should carry out. Lucy.
I'm thinking about the cloud in the mountain, and I think there's meant some sort of fire as well. I remember. So I know I think we've discussed, or I know about the burning bush, where God shows God's self somehow. And this is another one, another showing of of God, they're all very natural things, or with fire, or with a bush or a cloud. Are there many such sightings in the Torah?
We actually have one in this portion, which is an unusual one. It's just before the bit that we read. There are a lot of what we might call mystical revelations of God, and as some of them are famous, like the burning bush, and the one where God passes by Moses, and Moses is not allowed to see God's face, but only God's back. That's a very mysterious one. There's later on in the literature, there's ones about Elijah going up in a chariot of fire to heaven. I'm trying to find this one. It's
I think in this chapter, it was verse 10, the thing about the sapphire pavement.
that's the one I'm looking for. Yeah, do you want to read that for us?
I'm reading from Robert Alter. And they saw the God of Israel, and beneath his feet was like a fashioning of sapphire pavement, and like the very heavens for pureness. But against the elect of the Israelites, he did not send forth his hand, and they beheld God and ate and drank.
It's a very unusual one, because there everybody gets to see God, and we're taught in so many places that God has no likeness, or that we're not supposed to see God's likeness, and here it's a very different passage. The commentary finds this very difficult and suggests that it might be a different tradition from somewhere else.
Mm-hmm.
When does God stop showing up?
I think about 20 minutes.
Oh, really? The last mention of God appearing.
Well, the end of the Bible, really. After that, we don't get the idea that God spoke individually to people in the Jewish tradition. The rabbis never ascribe any kind of what's called non-mediated communion. In other words, from then on, from the end of the Bible onwards, the rabbis always believe that the Torah is the way you get to God. You don't have a direct communion with God. Judaism never holds that anybody then after that kind of speaks to God directly. The prophets, in many ways, it's by tracking the history of the prophets. So the last prophet is Malachi, who lives before the Common Era, and he's considered the last one who has kind of a conversation with God. After that, there are no prophets in Judaism. Yes, Rob.
So it might understand that even among the Orthodox, or you wouldn't hear a leader say, or a scholar say, God told me this.
Exactly. So if you take, again, someone ultra-Orthodox, one of the Rebbes, the Hasidic Rebbes, what they'll tell their followers is, I read the Torah last night, and I was a divine voice in the text, or my reading of the text was so powerful that I believe from now on we should do X.
A very quick anecdote, because I know we're at the end. I came from college, who's smarter than a college freshman? And I went to my grandmother and I said, you know, the business about keeping kosher, because she had moved in with us and now we kept kosher, which we never had before. And she said, yes. And I said, you know, well, I've learned there are cows in a field and they all play together and they all eat the same grass, and some are taken by the kosher butcher and some by the non-kosher butcher, but it's really the same cows and the same grass. And she's nodding and she's nodding and she's nodding. So I said, so it doesn't make sense to pay all that extra money to keep kosher, does it? And she said, no. And I said, is you're going to keep kosher? And she said, yes. And I said, why? Because she said, if God changed his mind, he would have told me.
That's a good note to conclude on how to obey the law, right? Appreciate everyone's interest. This is obviously a huge topic. And if you're interested in any more like Jewish law and its evolution, we can find some more readings. Thanks for being with us. I wish you a
Thanks, Rabbi.
Thank you,
Thank
Rabbi.
you.
Thanks,
This
Shabbat
is great.
Shalom.
Thanks,
Shabbat
Rabbi.
shalom,
Shabbat shalom.
everyone.
Shalom.
Shabbat shalom.